Good morning, John. Last week after VidCon, I went to Disneyland and was reminded that, like most children of the 80s and 90s, and probably even today, I grew up knowing that this word was Disney, but not really understanding why. Like, this is not a D, and this isn't really a Y. It's like, gives them. Why? Well, John, I had some Coca-Cola and opened way too many tabs on my browser and did a lot of research. And I found this story to be very weird. So your first guess, wow, my hair. So your first guess is that it's Walt Disney's signature, right? And yet, here's Walt signing his name on an episode of What's My Line, and that doesn't look familiar. But it turns out that Walt Disney had lots of signatures. Some of them resemble the Disney logo, some of them do not, but none of them have a D anything like the loopy D. I can imagine this constant innovation on his signature in two ways. It may be just another manifestation of his perfectionism, which was well known, or it may be a man who was pretty obsessed with his own name. But before we go any deeper into this, we have to discuss something else very weird about the Walt Disney Pictures logo. For almost 50 years, there wasn't one. Every movie had a different treatment for the title card. There was a Disney signature that, with slight variations, showed up repeatedly, originally not as a logo, but as a signature after a statement thanking the staff in 1937's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That signature was last used as a title card in The Rescuers in 1977, but it was never identical to a previous usage, making it decidedly not a logo. The graphic design nerd in me feels like this must be an intentional choice because it was very contrary to how every other movie studio was doing things. It's almost as if Walt and the Walt Disney Company wanted there to be a perception that this was a person presenting it rather than a corporation. So the name is the brand, not the branding. Here is a man you can trust to make children's content. Savvy. After The Rescuers, The Fox and the Hound used a nondescript serif font, almost like a palette cleanser, before 1985's The Black Cauldron launched with the now familiar Loopy D. This was 1 year into Michael Eisner taking over as CEO and becoming the first person to run Disney who was not a Disney family member. Now, there are a number of Disney designs that look similar to this final incarnation that I imagine will be in use until the universe ends. There's this from the 1950s Peter Pan board game, which matches the Disney logo almost perfectly, except for that D. And then there's this signature, an actual Walt signature that contains lots of the elements, that W, the looping T, the big circle on the I, even the quick and intense return on the S. But that D, though, where did it come from? Well, the closest I could find is in the final end card of the Aristocats, which came out in 1970. Maybe importantly, this was the first movie Walt Disney Pictures released that Walt himself did not work on. It's on the screen for like 3 seconds, but it's clearly as close as we get to the Loopy D before the early 80s, when Disney launched its home video division, using this familiar logo type as the title card, but in the box art, the Loopy D! Soon, that logo type with the Cinderella Castle and Shooting Star would become the first actual logo of Walt Disney Pictures. So somewhere, someone behind the scenes in the early 80s decided to make that little D-loop into a big, bold spiral. They pushed that so far that the first letter in one of the most iconic brands of all time doesn't read clearly as a letter. Under Eisner's leadership, this clean and playful logo type became the logo type for the entire studio, and then a Disney Channel, a Disney World, and the Disney Company as a whole. And it's easy to make it read more clearly, as London-based illustrator Pencil Bandit made clear with these modified versions, but that's not what they wanted. Almost all of this logo type was taken directly from one of Walt's many signatures, except for its most bold, iconic, and confusing choice. But because Disney is all about magic, and magic can be lost when you find out how it's done, we probably will never find out how this happened or who did it. Maybe that's for the best. John, I'll see you on TV.
The happiest place on Earth has been closed for about 10 months, and it probably won't be reopening anytime soon. California isn't allowing theme parks to reopen until the counties they're located in have fewer than one COVID infection per 100,000 residents for 7 consecutive days. The rate here in Orange County currently exceeds that by about 90-fold. We're going to be stubborn about it, California Governor Gavin Newsom said in October. Newsom's stubbornness is one of a kind. Every other Disney property in the world has reopened. In California, some of Disney's retail and dining is allowed to open, but the rides and attractions remain closed. The city of Anaheim, meanwhile, looks like a ghost town. The Mouse provides 78,000 jobs and is the center of the local economy. Disney World in Orlando opened in July as Florida's case rates were climbing. The reopening amounts to a breathtaking effort by a corporation to prove that it can safely operate at a highly dangerous time, the New York Times observed. YouTubers created dark parodies of the reopening.
You don't belong here.
But the surge never came. This is the tale of two Disneys and two radically different approaches to managing the COVID-19 pandemic.
You got a lot of people in your profession who waxed poetically for weeks and weeks about how Florida was going to be just like New York. Wait 2 weeks, Florida's going to be next. Just like Italy, wait 2 weeks. Well, hell, we're 8 weeks away from that, and it hasn't happened.
The media savaged Florida Governor Ron DeSantis when he and a handful of Southern GOP governors pushed to reopen most businesses in early summer of 2020. DeSantis' strategy from the get-go had been to shield Florida's seniors by issuing executive orders to temporarily ban nursing home visitations and prohibit readmission of COVID-positive patients, in contrast to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's order forcing nursing homes to accept COVID patients. A couple months later, with case rates falling, National Review editor Rich Lowry asked, "Where does Ron DeSantis go to get his apology?" Then, when cases surged over the summer, Los Angeles Times columnist Michael Hilzick delivered on the requested apology. "Sorry, you're even worse than I imagined," he wrote. But by the end of the summer, cases were falling in Florida and rising in areas of the country that were in full or partial lockdown. California, which had the nation's most stringent policies related to COVID-19, began to experience a massive second wave in November. Florida was also seeing a spike in cases and deaths, though it was less severe. While the California and Florida approaches to COVID-19 were vastly different, their outcomes began to look remarkably similar. If some in the media had been too quick to condemn DeSantis, others had also been too quick to declare victory for Newsom. In April, The Atlantic had extolled California's dramatic success in containing the coronavirus pandemic. What's clear about the impact of Newsom's policies is that they've taken a devastating toll on working-class California residents. The Golden State shed 8% of its jobs compared to 5% in Florida. It experienced the fifth highest drop in GDP among U.S. states and a much higher drop in tax revenue. California now has more total cases per capita and is approaching Florida's total deaths per capita, despite having a younger population. California residents have been flouting the lockdowns and challenging them in court. A recall petition for Governor Newsom has gathered more than 3/4 of the required 1.5 million signatures to make the ballot.
There are probably 50,000 people in a 3 square mile that are out of work right now due to the restrictions placed by California's governor.
Here in Anaheim, Fred Brown has been the general manager of Desert Palms Hotel in the literal shadow of Disneyland for 24 years. So far, he's had to lay off 80 employees, including his own daughter.
If we don't have guests, I don't know how long some of these hotel owners are going to be able to last without throwing in the towel and going into bankruptcy.
I don't think the state of California has done the best job keeping businesses afloat.
Mike Afram shut down his shuttle company in March, laid off 100 employees, and has been unable to reopen since.
Well, unfortunately, I think a lot of small businesses related to the resort or even unrelated to the resort are not going to survive. They won't come back.
This is a death knell for tens of thousands of jobs. These are working class jobs and hundreds of small businesses in and around the resort. He's usurping precious freedoms away from the private sector and increasing our residents and our workers' reliance on government just to get by.
Trevor O'Neill is an Anaheim City Council member. He says tourism accounts for almost $100 million of annual tax revenue for Anaheim.
That goes a long way to be able to fund our vital city services, our public safety, our police and our fire, our road repair, everything that a city has to do, and allows us to be able to keep our taxes on our residents low.
Disneyland as a corporation has been very successful in opening its parks around the world, and including the one in Florida. And they have proven to know what they're doing and know how to do it safely and securely. So I don't see why it would be any different for us here in California or in Anaheim.
Disney is known for its expert handling of logistics, and the company drew widespread praise when it brought back the NBA playoffs here in Florida by creating a so-called NBA bubble that successfully prevented any players or staff from COVID infection over a 2-month span. California is also home to Universal Studios and Six Flags, in addition to smaller amusement parks with no giant corporate backer to float them through a 10-month shutdown. The contrast between California and Florida reflects growing evidence that lockdowns are not an effective strategy for managing a viral respiratory epidemic.
Our estimates showed that lockdown had a really dramatic effect in reducing transmission.
A June 2020 paper in Nature claimed that lockdowns would save 3 to 4 million lives worldwide, but it assumed without evidence that slowing the spread was due to lockdowns rather than voluntary behavior, and that as lockdowns stretched on, they would remain just as effective as in the early days of the pandemic. After it was published, places with stringent lockdowns, including California, the United Kingdom, and Italy, experienced second